Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our WSR live streaming sessions. It's been a few weeks. Today we're going to kick off our short series, our latest short series, featuring the study plans that are required as part of the federal impact assessment process. And with me today is my usual co-host and the project facilitator, Michael Fox. Mike, how are you today?
I'm doing good, Don. It's good to be doing these live streams again with the WSR approved tour in terms of reference.
Yeah, it feels good, doesn't it? It feels good to have that approved tour. Yeah, well, maybe to give our viewers a bit of a background, we're doing these radio shows and streaming sessions to help community members and the general public better understand what's involved in the federal impact assessment process, as well as the provincial environmental assessment process. The study or work plans are required as part of the federal process, where the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada provides the overall work plan called the Tailored Impact Statement Guidelines, or TISG we like to call it, and the proponent, so the project sponsor, the initiator of the project, is responsible for preparing individual work plans or study plans for the different components of the impact assessment. So today we're going to look at 4 of those study plans, Mike, and I think the best way to describe these is ones that maybe people won't necessarily think of right away when they're thinking about an environmental assessment, because we're going to look at things, we're going to look at the acoustic environment, we're going to look at the visual environment, we're going to look at climate change, and climate change / air quality, and cumulative effects. So maybe before we get started, Mike, if you could maybe explain to our viewers the difference between the sort of federal and provincial processes when it comes to like the work plans for the environmental assessment or the impact assessment. Just because there are differences, aren't there?
Yeah, there are, and who initiates what. I think in this case, I think the prime mover is always the proponent, and through what they call a project description. So if you have an idea that you want to build something out in Canada, normally you put together a project description, and usually there's some field studies, some site investigations, just to get some idea, some parameters and definition around a project. And then you put that into a document called a project description. So as part of that, for the province, you also put together terms of reference, and we mentioned that earlier. And that terms of reference really is just a suite of studies, related to the environment and physical and social, et cetera. And that goes through a process, provincial process, back and forth, public reviews, et cetera, that ends up being your work plan, for the provincial environmental assessment. For the feds, when you submit the same document, the project description, so to speak, to the federal government, they determine whether there has to be an impact assessment done on the project. And when they do, then they issue the work plans. In this case, it's called the Tailored Impact Statement Guidelines, which is, again, the federal version of environmental work plans. So that's the key difference. So the federal government gives it to you, like it tells you what you're going to study, and then it's a sort of a back and forth with the province, what has to be studied for around the project.
With input from the public on the provincial side too, right? So, well, let's get started with our first work plan, and that's the one on acoustic environment. So maybe as a bit of a background for our viewers, let's explain about what acoustics actually is. So acoustics is a science, it's a branch of physics, and it deals with the production, control, transmission, reception, and effects of sound. So everything to do with sound, basically. You often hear, Mike, when they talk about the acoustics of a room or the acoustics of a building, they're talking about the ability of that building to sort of preserve that originated sound, I guess, is the best way I can think of describing it. A room with good acoustics or a concert hall with good acoustics is one where it sounds just like it's the way it's produced, I guess, is the best way to describe it. So maybe you can walk us through what's involved in the acoustic environment work plan, Mike.
Yeah, so it's, sound is one of those things where, as you go, as you walk through life and we hear something loud, we just notice, it's loud. Like, or you hear someone screaming, it captures our attention, et cetera. So we don't really think about it unless it's those sort of audible events. So with projects, they actually, part of the plan is sound studies, acoustics. So they can, figure out what potential effects the project has on the sound environment.
Yes.
So sounds can scare animals. It can, fish, can be disturbed by it, and not just people.
Yes.
Birds, etc. So there's an interplay between levels of sound, and the natural environment as well as the people
Yes.
in that. So they look at this project, what type of noise, how does that noise affect certain parts of the environment, including the human environment, and they look at different phases, the pre-construction, construction, and operations of it. So it's a simple tool, but it's very sophisticated.
Maybe we can have a look actually at that.
Oh, yeah?
If we go to slide number 4
Oh,
in
excellent.
our slide deck, we can show everyone exactly what the equipment is that's going to be installed. I think we've got that up on the screen now.
Yep. Yeah. So as you can see on the left side, I guess, of the screen, an acoustic recording equipment. So this is what it actually looks like. So they put that in the fields along the route of the WSR project. Probably the closest one will be in the community. That's the starting point. And then they record these sounds throughout the environment with these sound devices. And so I believe they're going out this weekend.
That's right. That's right, Mike. They'll be there, I believe, on Friday, maybe Saturday, to install the acoustic recording equipment in 3 locations. Like you said, one location close to the community, another one, I believe, closer to the airport, and then one further along the route, so they can cover basically the general route.
And they're trying to figure out the baseline conditions right now.
Exactly. It's like all the other studies that are done in this project. The core work is establishing that baseline, right? Is understanding the way things are right now, so that you can judge later on whether whether you can judge whether there might be potential impacts, and then monitor down the road if necessary
or mitigate.
Or mitigate. Yes, that's
you know,
right. Yeah,
so.
you could sometimes eliminate. In some cases too, right? So this equipment basically is, from what I understand, it's recording sound levels and as you talked about, it's recording the different types of sounds too, right? The characteristics of sound. So this should give us, and the way it works is these are installed, and then the installer, who's usually an acoustics engineer, will come back 2 days later and pick up all the devices, because they will have logged, on their units, the sound characteristics and sound levels over the previous 2 days, and that should give them a good enough idea of what typical sound levels is like.
I'm actually curious.
I am too. Yeah, you might get some interesting sounds. You never know, right? So, anyhow.
So that's the acoustic environmental work plan.
That's it. Yeah, and. I guess we'll move on. We'll move on now to the visual environment work plan, and just like acoustic, it's one of those things you don't think about when you're thinking environmental assessment. When you're thinking environmental assessment or impact assessment, you're typically thinking things like wildlife and fish and water quality and things like that. But there is the visual environment is an important part and has become a more important part of an environmental or an impact assessment. And we'll get into this a little bit later. Part of that has to do with the tools now have become more sophisticated.
Right.
So I think, when we think of the visual environment and doing an assessment of the visual environment from a project, we we might think of those really extreme cases, right, Mike? Like if you put a skyscraper in a certain place, right? And oh, okay, that's a big visual impact. But you know, for something like an all-season road in a remote rural area, you don't think there might be any visual impact, but in fact there could be, right? Yeah. So these projects have to get looked at, and there's aspects of the project such as water crossings like bridges and gravel pits and quarries that have to be considered because they're all tied together as part of that project. So maybe Mike, you can talk a bit about this visual environment work plan. And that's slide number 5 for our technical team. Okay.
Yeah, so visual, again, people don't really think about, like you said, when it comes to studying the environment, people right away goes to landscape or animals or water, etc. So, but visual is another important thing as well for any major undertaking, because it does affect the aesthetics, the beauty of the environment in many cases. And so with the WSR, the visual environmental work plan will look at the visual scene based on the routing of the WSR project and how the road can impact sort of landscape views from important water and land-based viewing locations. So like the major water crossings where the bridges will be used, locations of the pits and quarries. And it looks at visual impacts of projects, both on pre-construction, construction, and operation phases, much like the other things. So the way they kind of do it is, again, we talked about LiDAR before, and so they'll fly, using LiDAR, figure out the height of land, so the topology, right? Or,
yep. Topography.
Topography, yep. Thank you, of sort of the landscape, and then from there figure, what would be the visual impact of a road going here, a road going there, kind of thing. So, so that helps inform, with the communities and others, where, from a visual perspective, what may be the impact on that. You don't really, again, usually see it with transmission lines, around rolling hills or near yes. mountain ranges, where the visual is the most important. Where the community is like, that's our view of the mountain, mm-hmm. That's our view we look at every morning, and the last thing you want to see. And that's why sometimes in cities, there's height restrictions for buildings. Like if you ever go to Washington, D.C., it's the exact yes. same height of all the buildings,
yeah.
Because
that's not just a coincidence,
no,
is it, Mike?
It's not. There's height restrictions. So visual is a big deal yeah. for some of these projects, and in this case, because of the pristine area, it may be important for the community.
It's a great point, Mike, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about this whole field or this whole discipline of visual, or looking at the visual environment. It's expanded a lot in the last mm-hmm. few years, and it's expanded because of technology, like the LiDAR technology you talked about, that gives you a very high resolution sort of picture as to the shape of the land, right, the height of the land. But then when you start mixing that with high resolution aerial imagery and drape that on top, you're getting closer to what it really looks like. Yeah. And these tools allow you to sort of put yourself at any location in that landscape. So I mean, it'll be difficult for our viewers to see, but on their screen on this slide, we have 2 images. One image, they're both of the same area actually. Mm-hmm. One image is a real oblique photo, like a photo taken from an aircraft yeah. of the proposed Winisk Lake crossing, and then the one above it is the same thing in Google Earth with a bridge, a proposed bridge, a possible bridge, inserted into place. And so the way the technology works is that you could put an observer or a viewer at any location in that landscape. So you're just inserting yourself right into the scene at mm-hmm. different places, whether it's on the water as if you were in a boat, or on top of a hill or whatever. And so it helps community members get a better idea True. Of what the road might look like, the bridge might look like if it were put there. So that's going to be a really interesting part of this work. What we are encouraging community members to do is to identify locations that are important to them, that maybe they want preserved, and we can take that into consideration when, as part of this visual environment work plan as well. So the next work plan we're going to move on to is a big one, and you know what I'm talking about, Mike. It's climate change and air quality, and that's a big one.
Yes, it is.
The effects of climate change are being discussed more now than ever before, everywhere, but particularly in remote Indigenous communities, because things like winter roads that used to be open for longer periods of time, like maybe 2 months or 2.5 months, are now in some cases, in some years, being only open for a month, which has real ramifications and impacts on communities. So climate change is a serious topic, a really serious topic, and one not to be taken lightly, and it isn't in an environmental assessment or an impact assessment. So maybe, Mike, you can first talk about the goals of the climate change and the air quality plan.
Oh, the goals of climate change.
Let's go to slide number 6.
Okay, so there's for this project, climate change is a big term, and it depends who you are. It can mean everything, and in our case, we're looking specifically on this project. So the 3 goals for the climate change work plan is one is determine the greenhouse gas emissions the project is expected to produce, so GHG as they call it. Number 2 is determine how sensitive and durable the project and its environment are to changing climate conditions. Number 3, determine the project's production of air contaminants and their impact on air quality on the project. So those are the climate change air quality work plan elements and the goals around it.
Let's talk a bit about air quality now, Mike. We don't often think about this when it comes to roads, other than just vehicles traveling on roads, but exhaust can come from a lot of different sources at a lot of different phases during construction, after construction. So just to give our viewers a bit of a sort of an idea of the kinds of things that we think about when we're looking at how much exhaust or how many contaminants could be generated from a project. Let's think about some of the different sources. They might be construction equipment, right? They could be just road vehicles in general, hauling materials, whether it's gravel or rock to help in the construction of the road. Could be heavy machinery used during vegetation clearing. As I mentioned, handling materials such as gravel, construction of the road. The aggregate extraction process and the processing of the aggregate, crushing of rock, uses energy, burns fuel. The camps themselves, the worker camps, require diesel generators that have exhaust that generates emissions. Blasting activities can impact air quality, even on mainly on a temporary basis. But that's another factor, and so there's a lot of different sources of air contamination or potential emissions in the course of doing a project. So let's move on now to slide number 8, I believe, and there's a number of, as we move on back to climate change again, from outside of air quality, there's a number of climate change considerations that we think about when building and maintaining an all-season road such as this one. And maybe, Mike, you can take us through what some of those considerations are.
So when we think about road design, for any proponent, if they're going to build something, say it's a house, you want it. It's whether it's a a straw house or a mud house or actually a brick house, like what's the extent of why you building it, to what what's the duration or lifespan. So when it comes to roads, they're typically built to last, right?
Yeah.
So, as you know, Webequie being the proponent of WSR, you know, they don't think just about the environment, you know, and anything that sort of you know, that are built around it or in it, but they also think about the actual thing that they're considering. So, you know, as this Indigenous-led type project, an EA, you got to think about, okay, here we are in the far north, in a landscape, you know, that's pretty fluid in terms of water, weather,
Yes.
and in some cases extreme. So you know, you got to think about the road design in relation to its immediate environment. In this case, you know, the climate, you know, that it's dealing in. So that's why in some cases in other projects, they, you know, we have a, you know, like wind power, they have quote cold climate packages. You know, there's different ways you design certain things. Well, in this case, road design, we're going to look at sort of the height of the road. We're going to look at you know, bridges and the height of those bridges, culvert pipes, etc. Like all those things, things for, you know, like stones, you know, to protect from you know, high flows. You know, so you got
Erosion.
like yeah. So you got, remember, it's kind of like you said before. You know, we're in waterways and bog and stuff like that all around. You know, like the creeks. You know, there's the swampy areas, and you gotta think about how the climate could impact that road.
Right.
So as an Indigenous proponent, they think about the environment, how the road's going to impact the environment.
Yes.
But you know, and they switch their hats. They think about, well, as the, you know, the proponent of the road, how does the climate impact our project? Because you know, safety is a big deal in their mind. Like they
Yes.
don't want washouts, you know, while
That's right.
people are driving on it. You know, and they look at, you know, the habitat. You know, is there, you know, fish, you know, that can get harmed and stuff like that. So it's a big deal, you know, climate change considerations when it comes to road design.
You're right, Mike, and you want that road to be stable, right?
Yeah.
You don't want that road to be constantly washing out and putting you know, fine material into the water and affecting the clarity of the water and aquatic habitat. You want that road to stay where it is. Yes. So you know, that's why you have to look into these considerations. Do your homework, really, like
Yes.
in doing the design, basically, in a nutshell. So yeah, that's a big consideration as part of this work, and let's now move on, because our time's running short, as always, Mike. Let's move on to the one that maybe is probably the hardest one to explain, I would say, I guess.
Yes.
Would you say so? Mm-hmm. This is the cumulative effects. So when we talk about cumulative effects, we're looking at other past, current, and future projects that, when I mean future, meaning ones that we could reasonably predict might happen in the future. And so we're looking at these projects to see if the impacts from those projects, in combination with the impacts to the supply road, will generate significant environmental impacts that may not be able to be managed, right, to be mitigated or controlled. So, Mike, there's a number of steps that's involved in this process, and they kind of make sense when you actually go through and look at them. Maybe you can take us through those 5 steps.
And with our 5 minutes left over.
1 minute per step, Mike.
All right, for basically 5 steps: scoping, analysis, mitigation, significance, and follow-up. What does that mean? So you know, scoping. You know, does the project affect something that's important to the community? So what's important to the community, we call, you know, when we say we, the environmental folks, value components, or VCs. So what's valued by the community? What's important to the community?
This is slide number 9, by the way,
Yeah.
just so everyone knows.
So scoping, does the project affect something that's important to the community? That's what they mean by. If yes, then decide, you know, the area to investigate in the time frame. Within the area, once it's identified, within the area and the time frame, are there other projects, present, you know, or past, present, future, that will affect what's important to the community, or the value component? And if so, if there are value components that will be affected, these become part of the analysis phase of the process. And the next step is to figure out how the project will affect the value component, and then identify how to eliminate or control the effect and how significant is it, and then monitor the area to see if the impact is being controlled. So that's basically cumulative effects in our work plan that we have, that the process by which we're going to go through.
Good explanation, Mike. It's a complicated thing, and I think that breaks it down pretty nicely. Maybe to help explain things a bit further, I'll give some examples of, and that's slide number 10, some examples of cumulative effects. So let's say, for example, we look at fish and fish habitat. So there might be destruction of fish habitat, maybe not from one project on its own, but when it's added to all the other projects, there could be significant, impacts to fish habitat. So that's one example. It could be, if you look at aquatic species, there could be destruction to the shoreline caused by these multiple projects, sort of adding up into one big impact. And that could cause, for example, a certain aquatic plant to be damaged or affected, which in that maybe that aquatic plant provides cover or food for other species as well. We could look at things like physical and cultural heritage. There could be damage caused to sites that are important to community members, that are used for for spiritual reasons. Just by adding up all the impact of all these activities, whether it's, for example, if you had high water flows through a certain area caused by water released from different projects that blew out an important section along a river where there were historically different ceremonies that were important to community members. That might be one example. The projects added together, the impact of the projects added together could affect the land use by community members. It could affect resources, for example, fish and wildlife. So this is, again, it's giving these examples to everyone here. It just shows you can't look at these projects, can you, Mike, in isolation?
No.
You've got to look. You've got to realize that project sits within an area, a project area, but it's also surrounded by other projects. Some of them may be part of the same watershed, therefore might have, because of that, might have more of an impact. So, to do this properly, that's you have to do that cumulative effects analysis. So,
and if I can remember, in the improved tour, we actually going to do a report just for the Indigenous community.
We certainly do. You're right.
Cumulative effects. So,
and every environmental assessment and every impact assessment has a cumulative effects component, right? So it's the project. Maybe many years ago, there was no cumulative effects component, but there has been for quite a while now, and the expectations on that are higher than ever before, are they, Mike? So, well, that just about wraps up today's session. That blew by, didn't it? Didn't it, Mike? Wow, boy, we had to talk a lot to get that in. So we're back again in 2 weeks with another streaming session at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Next week's topic, Mike, do you remember next week's topic? We had a lot of work plans.
Terrain, soil,
geology.
like all kinds of.
There's a lot of topics next week, and you can't miss it. I don't know how we're going to squeeze it all into 30 minutes. I don't know, we're going to have to talk faster if that's even possible for us. So anyhow, we welcome everyone to visit our project website at supplyroad.ca and visit our social media outlets just by searching up hashtag WSR.
WFN Supply Road.
WFN Supply Road. Thank you, Mike. You're in charge of the social media side of things. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we will talk to you again in 2 weeks. Miigwech.
Miigwech.